Hello, everyone. We'll just give one more minute before we start. I'm just allowing people to join. I know everyone's really busy. It's 7 p.m. On my side, so people are usually rushing during traffic. Okay, I think that we're ready to start. Okay, so hello, everyone. Welcome to an interactive session on mobile device affordability. I hope you're all well in this time of challenging adversity. We're all going through something, but despite these challenges, we continue to remain resilient, and we should also be kind and humble. So many of us are dependent on mobile devices, like me. That's because it's part of my life now. I use technology, particularly my smartphone, consciously, so that it enables me to connect, create, and learn. But there are many people who are still without mobile devices because of various reasons. So I won't ruin the fun part, because this is where we will invite our key experts to share their stories. So before I start, please reminding everyone to mute their mic, and you can use the chat forum for the questions. And we also believe in an all-inclusive approach. So we have live captioning notes for the ones that are finding it difficult to hear. We also are recording this session because many of our registered participants are probably not able to join, so they will be able to view it later. So let's start. First up, let me introduce you to my amazing colleague, Teddy Woodhouse. He is our A4AI research manager, and he will give a short presentation on the device affordability report. Teddy, over to you.
Sorry, thanks, Anju. I lost track of where the mute button was. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. So what I'll do is I will just kind of warm up the room with a brief overview presentation of our latest device pricing report, and then hand over to our great panelists and Anju to moderate a discussion that'll be, I think, truly the more interesting highlight of the hour. But thank you all for the time, and hopefully I can keep this quite brief and just kind of go into the summary really quick. So to introduce the report, as you may have seen and hopefully have had a chance to look at, it's from luxury to lifeline, and focuses on kind of the role of mobile devices today in terms of the ICT ecosystem across the globe, and how mobile phones very much have transitioned from what was once a luxury device for only a select few for what is a lifeline for billions of people now today. So what we want to cover briefly is kind of 4 questions. What is the device affordability barrier? What are the consequences of this barrier? How do people overcome the barrier today? And then thinking with a little bit more long-term future, what are some of the things we need to do to reduce the device affordability barrier? And so what I wanted to start was a point where we actually started with our research as well was, this is a snapshot from the Gapminder data set. Which is a really interesting reflection of various people across the globe based off their household incomes of a number of things in their household, including kind of, what does your bed look like? Do you have a TV? If so, what does it look like? What does your living room look like? What does your front door look like? And one of the questions that they ask is, what is your most loved item? And interestingly, a number of people, of course, point out electronics, but most specifically, a number of people and 4 families here all pointed to a mobile device as kind of the most loved item in their household, which I thought was a really interesting point, because it shows both the growing importance of devices and how much value people put, not just monetarily, but kind of emotionally or kind of in a more intangible way into their mobile devices. I briefly wanted to explain some of the jargon and language that we use when we talk about mobile devices. There are 3 kind of example devices here. And we really classify mobile devices into kind of 3 categories: basic phones, feature phones, and smartphones. They all have slightly different features. Basic phones being, of course, the most basic and fundamental. They're the ones that are kind of, you consider them your brick phones. They do telephone calls, SMS. They may have some extraordinarily limited internet capabilities, but truly it's nothing going to be like kind of a web browsing experience as many of us are used to. Feature phones will have some of that internet connectivity, some of those internet browsing options, maybe some apps, and some functionality that kind of gets us closer to what is then a smartphone feature. Smartphones are quite unique because they're essentially small computers. They're easy to recognize because they're the ones that have touch screens, is also a key kind of way to distinguish between some of these devices. So smartphones that kind of have a tactile feedback system with a touch screen, full internet connectivity, multiple apps for multiple functionalities, and very flexible devices as well. And so you'll see here is kind of there's a line where you have the wealthier families in the Philippines and the United States had smartphones, while some of the families with lower incomes here in India and Ethiopia had more basic phones or feature phone. And so in our research, while we thought about kind of the way that all three of these types of devices affect the ecosystem broadly and kind of the economy of mobile devices, we really want to focus on, in terms of a policy trajectory, on smartphone ownership. And that's because one of the 4 pillars of meaningful connectivity, which is another piece of work that the Alliance has put out earlier this year, focuses on advancing smartphone ownership at an individual level. So in a lot of ways, our ultimate target that we're kind of proposing here to policymakers is focusing on smartphone ownership and focusing on getting more people to smartphone devices and being confident users of that. And that includes roles for other devices like feature phones, and we can get into an example of how that works. But in terms of kind of thinking about what are the end goals of what we're trying to achieve here, smartphone ownership is what we focus on and why we prioritize that data in this report. And one way we prioritize that data, for example, is through this map. So this map looks at average smartphone price and affordability in individual countries, and it's split up into the quartiles. So you have, of the 70 countries that we studied, they're all low and middle income countries. What are the kind of the 25% that are the most affordable, then the second, then the third most affordable, and then the least affordable 25% of those countries. So it's not necessarily weighted by how unaffordable or how affordable those devices are, but they're kind of clustered into 4 groups so you can see the spread across the globe. And kind of the key regional trends you can see here is that in the Americas, devices are comparatively cheaper. At the same time, incomes are generally a little bit higher in the Americas. So that's part of the effect of why you see affordability being lower there. Whereas in other areas, particularly in West Africa, Central Africa, and in South Asia, devices remain very unaffordable, if not extremely so in many instances. And so just to mention that kind of affordability is price over average income. And that's really important in A4AI's work. We focus on not just making things cheap in terms of kind of US dollar value, but cheap relative to what people can actually afford. Because it's really important to take in the context of someone's income in terms of, is this something that they're going to be able to afford on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis as part of their life over time? Or is it just going to be a luxury as it once was? And so, this is kind of the state of play as we understand it, and kind of a good depiction of what is that device affordability barrier that I mentioned earlier. And so to give some consequences, what does this mean? This is kind of the headline stat we've been using with the report, is that 2.5 billion people live in a country where the cost of the cheapest smartphone available, as we measured it in our device pricing study, is the same as how much an average European household is going to be spending on all of their housing and utilities in a month, which is roughly about a quarter of their income. And so it shows that for 2.5 billion people, a smartphone is a huge expense. Sometimes it's simply too big of an expense. And this also, of course, talks only about average in relation to average income. Of course, with incomes, there's a diversity in many societies. And so those who are kind of at the lower end of the spectrum and lower earners, of course, are going to have an even harder time affording a device, and an even higher barrier in terms of accessing a device. And so one thing we wanted to stress as kind of the consequence of this is, the device affordability barrier could also be called a device divide. And this device divide is part of the digital divide that we understand in the world, where only about half the world's population is online. Because to access the internet and to make use of it, you have to have access to a device that kind of lets you connect into the internet. And there are kind of 4 groups that we wanted to highlight in our study. as part of kind of those who are the most vulnerable or least connected or kind of worthy of particular attention as we think about how are we overcoming this affordability barrier and the device divide. And this comes out of the focus groups that we conducted in West Africa, but also some of the focus groups that were conducted with similar research in Colombia and Indonesia as well. And some of the groups that we highlighted were kind of women who were targeted because women typically have lower incomes on average, and also because social norms and gender expectations also kind of relate to the rates and frequency at which women own smartphones. For young people are more likely to buy from a secondhand market. And that means that those devices are going to be a bit older. There might also be some other complications, and we'll get into that a bit later. Also, those living in poverty, those with lower income, the same smartphone for someone living in poverty versus someone not living in poverty is going to be much more expensive and much more difficult to afford for that person. And so they're less likely to buy that phone. And in many cases that we were talking to people living in poverty or near it, they were buying, working towards or buying cheaper or more limited devices. And then also those living in rural areas. There's another income factor here where people living in rural areas typically have lower incomes than those living in urban areas. But there's also a really big dynamic that we see here where people living in rural areas are very concerned about having a long battery life. And that becomes almost kind of the preeminent concern, is making sure that your phone is going to be able to kind of last not just a day, but multiple days, because electricity can be quite sporadic in terms of its availability and its reliability. And why we really wanted to focus on this and why we think it's really important is we want to encourage kind of a change in mindset from thinking about devices and technology like this. It is going to be critical for countries who are kind of planning their way out economically, but also socially from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we really want to encourage a pivot in thinking from thinking about, what is the important part of the internet infrastructure as just being kind of the higher capacity stuff, the towers, the submarine cables, the internet exchange points. We want to broaden that definition out and also encourage policymakers to think about devices and how they relate into this broader ecosystem, because without devices, we could have all this nice infrastructure, but if no one can actually connect into it and use it, it's not realizing the full potential. It's not helping people kind of advance themselves as well. So really trying to think about that change and encourage kind of a more holistic and comprehensive perspective when we're thinking about what really matters in terms of broadband infrastructure that needs to be built out. And so what I wanted to turn to now was a few examples from our study of kind of how people are overcoming the affordability barrier that exists today. And so I've pulled together a few case studies and some examples from the research we've done. One of the most interesting countries in our affordability data set was India. As you may have seen, it was in the least affordable quartile of the 70 countries we measured. And interestingly, the situation has actually changed since we've done this study. Some new devices have come into the market, and that's moved the price point down, which is quite heartening and in many ways. But it's an interesting point here as well, because it's also a great demonstration of the role of feature phones in a market. So here are 4 price quotes from Jio, which is the largest mobile operator in the country. And that's how we found our price quotes, is we went to the largest mobile operator in each country to see what smartphones they had on offer. And so you have here the Jio Phone 2, which is a feature phone, which is also the most affordable phone of these 4 devices. You have the itel A23, which is now the most affordable smartphone that was available on their website earlier this month, or I guess it's now technically last month because we're now into October. Interestingly, this cell phone wasn't available back in March when we were doing our price quotes, and so it wasn't used at that point. But it shows the importance of the shift that comes out of operators and the choices they make in terms of what devices to make available to their customers. But what you did see a lot from Jio were higher end devices, such as Google Pixels and Apple iPhones, which have higher retail markups and are a bit more lucrative as well for operators in terms of providing this service to their customers. But an interesting thing here is that you see kind of the very quick acceleration of what these devices mean in terms of fractions of a monthly income. Of the Geophone and the iTel devices are 23 and 29% respectively, whereas the other two devices are multiple months of the average income in India to afford. And so for many people, they're simply unaffordable devices at this stage. And so it's really trying to prioritize how do we make other devices more available at the lower end of the market, which can also help. And this includes feature phones, because this can help lower the device barrier and encourage new users into the market, get familiar with what the internet is, how it works, build some digital skills, see what the potential is, and in many ways kind of progress onto more advanced devices when kind of the personal investment in higher quality infrastructure might be particularly important for someone, if they're connecting their professional life online or something like that. And so that's part of the thing we wanted to emphasize here, is that you have instances in countries where smartphones can remain unaffordable, either because of income dynamics or because of other dynamics that play in the market. And so feature phones play an important role in terms of kind of building rungs in the ladder of making devices more affordable for users, bringing them on, and kind of reducing the scale of that affordability barrier so we can help bring more people online. I also wanted to mention the focus groups we conducted. We conducted focus groups in about five countries in West Africa. And one of the most interesting things that we were asking about is getting stories of how different people kind of acquired their phone. And there's a lot of different dynamics that people will do. Of what we focused on in terms of the pricing data on first-hand devices bought directly from a vendor, because that's the easiest to have a cross-country comparison and kind of a consistent data set. A lot of users, particularly those that I mentioned in those four groups of women, lower income, young people, or those living in rural areas, found other ways of acquiring a phone. And so you could buy it secondhand, which, for example, many young people were doing. That has a lot of questions around trust in terms of who's selling the phone, how good the phone is it in good condition, is it part of the gray or black market in terms of was it stolen and then resold or not. Receiving it as a gift was particularly common among women participants in our focus groups, which again, I think shows some of the gender dynamics at play in terms of device ownership and availability of kind of what's considered appropriate for a woman versus a man in terms of how much they're spending in terms of buying a device for themselves. And then also sharing amongst family and friends. That was also quite common, particularly in lower income instances or in rural instances where electricity might be less available. It's kind of whose phone has battery power, and sharing across a whole household or kind of a number of households to both kind of collectively reduce the affordability barrier, but also in terms of just recognizing the more sporadic availability of these devices generally. And here are some quick quotes from examples of our focus groups that were kind of focusing on the secondhand market. And again, what's driving many users to this is the factors of income. I think it may be a budget issue, a lack of means is why buyers come to this, but also concerns of they might not be as durable, or they might likely be more stolen as well. One last case study I wanted to mention before I turn on to the last part of my presentation is kind of an example of devices as universal service. In Malaysia, there was actually a really successful program where the Universal Service Fund in that country started subsidizing devices, particularly smartphones, to make them more affordable and targeting towards young people to encourage them. And this was just as smartphones were kind of catching on in the country, to encourage them to get one of these devices, get used to it. And through that, you started seeing kind of intergenerational impacts of young people then teaching their parents or their grandparents how these devices work, and kind of a chain effect almost in terms of more people coming online and greater connectivity out of that. And so ultimately, very briefly, just kind of what does this mean in terms of we see people being creative and how they overcome the barrier today, but what are some of the ways that we can reduce the device affordability barrier when we think ahead? We really focused on in the report in 4 areas. It's reducing taxes on low-cost internet-capable devices. And so in many ways, that's making devices cheaper in kind of a private market sense. Using universal service access funds to make devices more affordable for the poorest in a country. And so that's kind of a more active approach from the public sector, from the government. And then the last one is focusing development aid on pilot innovations such as microfinancing and microloans for device affordability and availability. And here is really about kind of targeting where facilitating that pivot in mindset away from just development aid and international financing, supporting kind of the higher capacity part of the ecosystem, but also thinking about how we can support the margins of the network as well and get more people online ultimately to make benefit out of these other parts of the internet that are being constructed anyways. And so, yeah, so that's a quick brief introduction of the report. Happy to answer questions in the chat, but for now, I'll hand it back over to Anju and listen along with all of you all to our excellent panel that we have for the rest of the hour. Anju, over to you.
Thanks, Teddy. The device affordability report sets the scene for our panel discussions, particularly on the work we are doing to ensure that everyone has full access to mobile devices and services. And Teddy, thanks for highlighting the digital gender gap, which sort of gives an intro on one of our speakers, a very important part of our work. So let's get to the next part of the session. We're going to hear from our wonderful panel of speakers. Let me introduce you to our incredible speakers. If I can ask them to please switch on their videos. Great, thank you. So we've got Sarah Farooqui, who is the Research and Advocacy Manager for Digital Empowerment Foundation in India. We have Sebastien Codeville, who is the CEO for KaiOS. And we have David Salomão, who is with the National Institute of Communications of Mozambique. So I'm going to go straight to Sarah because we also realize that there's not much time left. What is the device gap in India, and how does device affordability create a new digital divide in India? You're mute, Sarah. You're on mute.
Sorry, hi. Thanks so much. So I'm going to very quickly just draw your attention to these three headlines that I came across when I was, trying to see what I wanted to say in this panel. The first is from August 20th, which says that according to the National Council of Education, Research and Training, 27% of students in India at the moment don't have access to smartphones, laptops for online classes. The second is from August 19th, where, in the city of Mysore, no smartphone for e-classes is the reason a girl commits suicide. And in the complaint, the parents said that their daughter was disappointed because they could not buy her a smartphone and she was not able to attend online classes. And the third is from a couple of days back, from October 1st, where again, no smartphone to attend online classes. A 15-year-old girl commits suicide, and the police said that the girl had been going to a classmate's house, but she wanted her own phone. And because of the loss of employment during the lockdown and the pandemic, the family had financial issues, and she was not able to participate in her academic activities. So it's important to highlight that internet connectivity has always been an important aspiration for India and for Indians, if you want to bridge the economic and social divides and so on. But however, with the pandemic, what has emerged is that it has become an urgent necessity, binding various factors, which includes communication, learning, and almost all economic activity. And education is the one that's been most harshly hit because we have approximately 320 million students across India, all of whom have had to shift out of physical classrooms and are now on an online space. And it's not just enough to have a phone to attend these classes. You need to have an affordable smartphone per child in each family. You need internet connection and you need high bandwidth. And as Teddy mentioned, like smartphone in India, is unaffordable, and it's not just enough to it's ironic that in India data costs are cheap, but devices are not cheap. So, with the pandemic, with the job losses, pay cuts, economic slowdown, there has been no announcement from the government side for subsidies for, devices, for, access, for connectivity. None of the device makers have come out with differentiated payment systems. This is one area that's not been addressed at all. And the fact remains that, it's not just about communication or social media likes or entertainment on YouTube anymore. You need a phone if you want to access education, if you want healthcare, if you want financial services, if you want your public services. So yeah, that has been one of the main things that we're seeing, that device affordability in India right now is a topic that has to be discussed, especially if we're looking at the marginalized community, low income pockets, women in particular. The gender digital divide is something I can also talk about later, but that is also something that needs to be looked at and focused at quite urgently. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Sarah, you highlight critical points. Data plan may be cheap, but devices are not cheap. And while the COVID-19 pandemic has underlined that it is important to have internet access in today's world, there's still barrier to access and affordability. And like you said, students are struggling, but not only to get connected, but also in terms of mental illness as well. So
yeah,
particularly for our low and middle income countries. And I think we really need to place emphasis on this as well. So coming to Sebastien, you play a prominent role. So what is the role of feature phones in creating greater device affordability? And maybe you can talk about some of the barriers when we try to enter a new market, examples from Asia or Africa.
Yes, thanks for the question. So let me start maybe with a little bit of background. If you look at the challenge in being connected to internet today, we've got I think in the past 10 years a huge progress around the broadband coverage. So the networked infrastructure actually really progressed a lot, and now most of the population is covered. But you still have, as Teddy explained in the presentation, 4 billion people who are not connected to internet. Out of these 4 billion people, 2 billion people are feature phone users. And roughly, so as Teddy also explained in his presentation, 2.5 billion people cannot afford an average smartphone. So if you look at this number, really today the challenge is around the affordability of the device, but not only the affordability, and I'm going to explain that right after a bit more. So if you look at our target users, actually we are working and we are trying to bring devices to users who have roughly a $2 to $3 income per day. Usually they are not in a stable job. They are more in working for the informal sector. And they are living in emerging market and mostly in a rural neighborhood. So when you look at our customer, they are most of the time a first-time internet user. So why are they not connected to internet? We see 4 main reasons: the device price and the data price. So the affordability in general, not only of the device but also of the data, is the main challenge. We see each time we talk to people who are buying our devices. But then very soon come the ease of use and the accessibility. And this is also a device challenge. It's not related to the network. It's for somebody to jump into a smartphone when they have never used internet. It can be complex and frightening. And some people are worried to be, stolen their identity or their information, or maybe to have to spend too much money without having a control on this spending. So this accessibility and ease of use and trust factor is super important. And the third real key factor is the localization, and this is also linked to the device. So being able to have a device with your own language, local language, and being able to have access to local content as well. And the fourth one I would like to quote is the relevance. So if I have a limited disposable income and I want to spend, let's say, $10 or $20 this month, why would I spend it on an internet-capable device? What does it bring to me? And so there's a big challenge around that, which is also linked to the distribution. how are we able to explain the benefit of the access to internet, explain the benefit of the services that it will bring to the future users. So just quickly talking about what we do in KaiOS, actually we develop an operating system, and we are distributing an operating system which is used in feature phone. So the traditional phone, with the keyboard and no touch today, but we have a new product also coming soon. And this phone, basically it brings the best of the basic phones and the best of the smartphones, best of the basic phones through affordability of the device. This type of device is much cheaper than a smartphone. A battery life, as presented before, battery life is very important in rural area and emerging markets in general. A low data consumption, which is also critical. When you have a smartphone and you are looking at high definition video, and you have services running all the time, then the cost of data become a challenge. So with KaiOS devices, actually you control low data consumption and the robustness of the phone. It does not break basically. But beside that, you have applications. You have all the modern applications. You have an application store, and you also have a lot of internet services, modern internet services like LTE, GPS, Wi-Fi, and all these kind of things. On top of that, we bring device financing, which basically bring the cost of a KaiOS device to the cost of a 2G phone. So this is what we are trying to do to address the digital divide in our side.
That's excellent, Sebastien. You mentioned 2 billion feature phone users, and accessibility is an issue. And this is not just this is a device challenge, and for someone to use a smartphone can be challenging. And imagine our persons with disabilities who continuously struggle. Being able to have device with local language and content is also critical. And this comes to the important point of digital skills, having digital skills and content, which is really important. And you mentioned developing an operating system and using feature phone, traditional phone, which is super amazing. Maybe you can send one to me. So moving on to the next speaker, David. One of the recommendations from the report is to use universal service and excess funds to subsidize devices for those least able to afford. Maybe tell us some kind of programs that you have in your organization, and what sort of programs do you have in terms of, initiating device subsidies?
Thank you, Anju. Salomão David from the Communications Regulatory Authority of Mozambique. We have tried 2 or 3 approaches to mitigate the digital divide. Mainly what we did was, because of the issue of relevance to have a smartphone, we start from deploying public spaces with free internet access, mainly in schools and gardens around every city or main city in Mozambique, where we knew that there was pockets of people who are not able to afford access to the internet, and trying to make sure that these spaces you had a very reliable and fast internet connection. That was the first stage. Within this process, we try to deploy within the schools RM processors with screens which are low cost, low power, so that kids could have access to the internet, and also start getting the use or the need to do homeworks, assignments, and things like that. On a second stage, when we understood that yes, people are able to have access to the internet, and in these small gardens with high-speed connectivity, we start to study the number or the type of devices that were connected to that network, and we start trying to understand what are the social groups which normally go to these public spaces. As of now, with the new normal, we decided that it's time for us to tackle the revenue authority. We need to start talking with them so that the USF can have means to acquire high-speed broadbands and bring people from the informal sector to the formal sector, but being registered at some institution and at the same time have an access to a microcredit to have access to these devices which will be provided by the USF. I mean, as we already have got the network in place, it's time to populate this network with devices which are capable of dealing with LTEs or 4G networks, not only from the MNOs, but also the public spaces that we have created. So we are aware that these public places today, I mean, they are the only one space which people wish to not have financial means can have access to the internet. It doesn't matter how, it matters for us that we need to find ways to reduce the cost of the devices. I mean, the cost of devices in our case in Mozambique is mostly high because of the revenue taxes which are imposed by the states. It's a matter of the USF and revenue authorities sitting together and discussing the cost and the benefits of exempting the USF to buy these devices so that at the end of the day, this moves forward. But this is a process that we have been already discussing with revenue authority. We started from the infrastructure to be deployed in these public spaces, which have been accepted, and they've been seeing the benefits in all the municipalities, so that we can now go and probe to see, guys, we have done the first stage, which has been a success. So let's go to the second stage where we have to provide devices to people. They won't be for free, but they will be provided in such a way that everyone can benefit from them, not paying the actual market price, but paying a reasonable amount of money that can actually make them, I mean, make the entire ecosystem sustainable for the people. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Sebastien. You mentioned that we need to study the type of devices connecting to network and understand the social group. I think this is really important. And I like that you're targeting the revenue authority. This is critical, and having universal access funds to make sure that we also talk to the telco services. And this is available to not just one part of the world, but to a number of people, particularly marginalized groups, our underserved communities, and also, of course, persons with disabilities. So I'm going to bring it back to Sarah. Sarah, you just joined a wonderful organization 2 months ago. They work a lot with the rural and remote communities. But what does device affordability mean for the daily lives of consumers and your stakeholders?
Yeah, so again, DF has a huge spectrum of stakeholders, right? We work right from the artisan and weaver communities to women, marginalized groups, local governments, panchayat, education institutions, internet service providers. Like there's an entire spectrum. But one of the things that's emerged with the pandemic, it's been a great learning for us as well, which is that it's highlighted again, not just the digital divide, but also the need for affordable devices across, the need to think from a community perspective. So DF has been working for almost 2 decades to create site-based learning, and we've had these things called the Community Information Resource Centers, or CIRCs, that are community-oriented infrastructure and information hubs that are built to create, digitally literate, information empowered, communities that are equitable in terms of access, that are connected online. And, as of March 2018, we have almost, I think, 191 CIRCs. I think from, the March 2018 number is that we have 191 CIRCs across 95 districts, 23 states. So we're working in a very huge landscape with a huge population as well. But what has emerged is that with the pandemic, these CIRCs have emerged as a digital access point for people. And these are people who are not connected. Again, earlier, this was a choice. It was almost like an aspiration to be connected. And it was a choice for people to utilize these centers and the connectivity they provide. But now it has emerged as a necessity. And, because you have connectivity, there's the broadband-oriented public service access point. The number of people who are leveraging these has increased quite a bit. And this model is now being recommended to be adopted by state governments as well, that we need to create public access points with broadband so that people across population pockets are able to have equal, access to the internet, to connectivity, again, because everything now is online. The world is almost running online. the way we engage, the way we perceive connectivity has to shift. It's not about aspiration, or it's not a choice anymore. It's a necessity. And again, DF is also, we're concerned with how large number of people now can't access education, which is one of the primary areas, as I mentioned earlier. So we started this initiative called Digital Dan, which is which translates to digital donation. It's basically to crowdsource used devices, especially smartphones, which we reformat, we refurbish, and then we give it to individuals who don't have that digital access and connectivity at the moment. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how different population pockets are responding and are leveraging technology. But again, because of the pandemic, the necessity to have it equal, to have it on the same platform, you, me, anybody on the street, everyone needs the same connectivity, the same device, the same broadband. So we have to kind of understand how we navigate that landscape as well.
Very true. And congratulations for having 190 community centers. And these, like you said, these communities also need affordable devices. So I'm going to come back to Sebastien. We talked about tax and just briefly, but taxes can have a large impact on device cost. And in some contexts, governments need to make devices more affordable by reducing tax. What would be your thoughts on this?
Yeah, yes, right. So we see actually it's a very important question. You have countries where the taxes on devices, on mobile phones, can be up to 40-50%. So when you look at the cost of these devices, basically, and especially in the country where you have a kind of threshold, let's say at a certain price, above this price, the tax become really big, and below this price, which is basically only 2G phone, that could be below this price, the tax is very small. It's just a portion of that. It encourages the people actually to stay on 2G and not to move to internet-capable devices. So the tax, the policy is really important. If you look also at the benefit, I believe, but I'm not a regulator, but I believe the investment, basically the loss or the tax the government does not get from the internet-capable devices, the entry internet-capable devices, basically they will catch it up on growth of GDP, because there's many studies that shows that basically a 10% increase in broadband connectivity in a country actually lead to 2% or 2.5% of GDP growth. So this is really, I think it's an investment on the future to be able to reduce the tax on entry internet capable devices. And in many cases, the policy that has been defined maybe some time ago is really need to be rethought and more internet friendly in some ways.
Great, thank you so much for that. So you mentioned policies, and obviously reducing tax on low-cost internet-capable devices is very critical. David, do you have any thoughts on this in terms of reducing tax from your point of view?
Reducing taxes on low-capable devices. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I'll go on a different perspective. Let's look at why things become expensive. I mean, let's see if, as a regulator, if I exempt taxes for, let's say, for 3G networks, or trying to allow MNOs to have not 3 networks, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, but allowing them to have like a combination or a cocktail of 3, 4, and 5G only, and allow them to have fixed free spectrum on some specific bands. If that will reduce the price, perhaps yes. There's a different strategies here. I mean, as a regulator, you cannot always go to the revenue authority, but you also have to see within your organization what are the concessions that you can give to MNOs so that in exchange, they will give you free internet access in specific spots. Look at how 5G networks have been provided in Mozambique. What we said is that any MNO can have access to 5G spectrum as long as they provide 5 kilometers free network in any, let's say, Bay Area. We have a long coast, so we would like people when they go to the beach, so they can have access to free internet, like at least being the minimum speed for or LTE or 5G, something like that. I mean, as long as MNOs are taking that spectrum for 2 years, we are able to provide to those who don't have income free internet access in at least 5 kilometers in each state. So we have got 3 MNOs, we have got 12 states. So you can divide the states based on MNOs, and one of them will provide you 5 kilometers. If you sum 3 MNOs into 5, these are 15 kilometers that you can have free network in specific cities. So that's the approach that what I'm trying to say, not always you need to go to the revenue authority, but sometimes there are some concessions that you can do as a regulator to be able to provide affordable internet access. At the end of the day, the spectrum does not belong, it belongs to the state, it belongs to the people. That's what we are trying to do, giving this opportunity to people to have access to their own resources.
Great, thank you for that. And for our viewers that don't know what MNOs are, they are mobile network operators. Thank you. I just have to make sure that we don't use too many technical jargons because we also have other users as well. So, you know, we have 10 or 15 minutes left. And I want to open this opportunity to our viewers and participants. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, or you can use the chat forum. You're welcome to do so. Because we want to give you an opportunity to talk to our speakers and also interact with them and maybe ask some good critical questions as well. So anyone? Don't be shy because it's an interactive discussion. No one? Okay, so we'll continue the discussion. So Teddy, did you have a question? Oh, there is a question, sorry. Just a sec. For some reason, I can't see my... Oh, so Patricia, I will give the floor to you. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. It's a very nice discussion around affordability of the devices. So I'm wondering, how can civil society leverage the different partnerships, be them private and public, or private and private? How can we leverage those partnerships so that we continue to see the prices of the smartphones and all the digital devices going down? That's my question. Thank you.
Great, good question. So I'm going to get Sarah to respond, and then David, and then Sebastien. Sarah?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So again, one of the things is, I think we have to think of this question in terms of the world pre-pandemic and the world post-pandemic, sadly. And again, before, how we, our entire understanding of devices, of affordability was very different. But at this point, it's very important to make stakeholders across the spectrum, whether it's device makers, whether it is governments, whether it is other civil society organizations, everyone needs to understand that the entire role of technology, of devices, of connectivity, of the entire digital space, has shifted. It's not what it was, a year ago. And one of the key things is making different partners, whether it's even device makers, getting them to understand that your product is not an aspiration or not just a device for connectivity and, keeping in touch or, the internet as and when, but it is a basic necessity. If I want my identity, if I want healthcare, if I want education, if I want to just live as an entity that's, living at home, if I want to work, I need a device, I need connectivity, I need a certain amount of, capacity and capabilities within that device. So I think one of the main thing is, and that's why conversations like this are so important, because we have to understand the changing narratives, and that's how you get all the different stakeholders and all the different players in this entire conversation on board. So I think the first thing is to have this conversation and make people understand the changes that are happening in the world, and these are transcendental.
Very good point. David, would you like to add in terms of partnership and what can we do together?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty during this period. Like Sarah was saying, if it was 3 years ago, I'll give you the perfect cocktail. But as of today, it's not only about the civil society or entities organizing themselves and trying to probe for some specific device which will surprise the need of the majority, but it's also for those who develop devices to have certain that they will have a market where to sell these devices, not to have them and then at the end of the day not having where to sell them. It's interesting if we as nations or groups of people, we start designing what we actually need and for what we need. If we do not do that, I mean, we will be always being pushed devices that will be much more expensive because they are fancy, but at the end of the day, only use 10 or 15% of what they actually do. So it's all about organizing, mobilizing, and also deciding what we actually want. But at the end of the day, there will be devices that we cannot afford. And there should be a device that we can actually afford that will do most of what we actually need to do. That will be my take on it.
That is a fair point, and it also comes to the point that there are people who cannot afford it because of their income as well. So this is a critical point. Sebastien, would you like to add?
Yeah, yes, maybe I'll add quickly. And the question was also about private to private partnership and versus private to public. I think today, if you strictly look at the device affordability, there's a lot of work done on private to private partnership, especially between the MNO, the manufacturer, the content providers. But we have all to acknowledge that the economics on very affordable device, on people who access to internet for the first time, are different from smartphone in more mature markets. When you buy a smartphone, when you have a smartphone on a mature market and you spend $50 per month on your data, there's space to generate enough revenue over 12 months to give you a free iPhone or a free high-end devices. When you spend $1 or $1.5 per month on your data, actually, there's no much ARPU available to do any subsidies. So the economics are really different, and we need to have more and more actually private to public partnerships, especially around some of the items you listed before, which are the taxes, the regulation. USF is a great tool. It's probably time to use the Universal Service Fund to actually subsidize or finance the devices. It does not happen in many countries. Today, it's not the way it's used. So I really encourage all the public side to look at partnership with private companies to make devices more affordable. Economics are different. You can't have the same thoughts as you have with high-end smartphones.
Great. Thank you, Sebastien. I think we're running out of time as well. And I do realize that we did say 1 hour, and I'm also worried about people's time. So this has been great. Obviously, I want to continue this discussion, and this doesn't stop here. So I think my final thoughts on this is that, and bringing back to what Patricia said and others have said on the chat, is that we need government, public and private sector and civil society to work together in partnership and to support also projects to make more financing options available for consumers. And obviously, we also need to talk to and work with the major manufacturers to look at reducing some of these costs, especially for our low and middle income countries. And on that note, I will just hand it over to Teddy because he wanted to just say a few words before we finally wrap up. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Anju. Yeah, just to say it's been a really thrilling conversation, and I've been eagerly listening by. So thanks to all of our panelists for joining in and for contributing their thoughts today. Yeah, just to answer, I saw there was one last question from Tanya about kind of the environmental and social impacts, or kind of the other impacts of devices. And I think it's a great question. One, we unfortunately didn't get to cover in this report, but something that has been kind of the seed has been planted for further research by the Alliance to investigate this part and kind of ensure that as we advance for universal access, that we do so sustainably. There's a lot of issues, not just with devices, but across the whole architecture of the internet to talk about this issue. There are some incidental impacts. So one specific example I think we can use is talking about device taxation as an example of, shipping devices in has an environmental impact compared to local production. And so those aspects kind of interplay with each other. And it's a really interesting dynamic to understand kind of how the economics and the ecological impacts all come back together in relating to issues like that. But I think ultimately kind of a key thing is I wouldn't necessarily want some to have access and others not. And for us to use environmental concerns as a barrier, I think it's, there's got to be a trade-off in terms of, not in terms of ecology, but in terms of production and growth in certain areas of the region versus other areas of the region of the world, and kind of advancing, the sustainable means for everyone in the world to be able to enjoy the internet, both over the long term and with minimal environmental impact. So yeah, but again, really interesting conversation, and thank you everyone for coming along.
Great. Thank you. I just want, I know I kind of, we'll finish it off within but I will just give 1 minute each to the speakers to just say one key message, one important key message so that we can wrap it up from you. Sarah, starting with you, one key message only.
That's a difficult proposition, but again, I think the main thing is just to understand how can we, have access across populations, across geographies, and that's something we have to introspect over. It's not a conversation, it's not a report, it's something that has to have sustained conversations, and we need to understand meaningful connectivity as well as that's the term that's necessary to be understood at this point.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And Sebastien, one key message.
I think I already, I'm going to repeat myself a bit, but yes, looking forward more public-private partnership and innovative way actually to make device and internet affordable. So,
okay,
yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
David.
I would say we need to work more and together. We need to create synergies. That will be the aim of this. Thank you.
Indeed. Again, it's always about working together. So on that note, let me invite everyone to switch on your video so that we can take a photo. It's about working together. So let's see if people are able to switch on their videos. Our participants, you're welcome to switch on your video so we can also take a snapshot, a picture photo. Great, it's nice to see everyone. Hello. Tanya, Eleanor, Alicia. I see a WB479414. Let's hope you're not a hacker. Okay, I'm gonna take a photo. Ready?
Ready.
Smile. Oh, disappeared. People have disappeared. Alicia and Tanya. Okay, another one. Smile. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. And speakers,
Thank you.
really grateful for your time. But let's continue this conversation. And our viewers, thank you so much for attending. Please take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Sebastien, Sarah, and David, I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Teddy.